You're listening to the SSPX podcast, and welcome to episode 17 of the Crisis in the Church series. We're happy to welcome back Father Jonathan Loop, the principal of Immaculate Conception Academy in Post Falls, Idaho, to discuss the preparations that were carried out for the Second Vatican Council. We'll take a quick look at the First Vatican Council and what effect that had on this Second Council, as well as why Pope John XXIII wanted to convoke this council. Then we'll take a look at the preparations themselves. As you'll see, they were very extensive, and beyond some troubling details, they were in fact very traditional and caused the Archbishop to be optimistic about the good that this council could accomplish. If you'd like to learn more about this series we're doing on the Crisis in the Church, or go back and revisit our previous 16 episodes, or if you want to support this project, please visit sspxpodcast.com/crisis. Now, we'll turn to our conversation with Father Loop. You're listening to the SSPX podcast and welcoming Father Loop back to the Crisis in the Church series. And it has been a little while since we've talked. How are things going up in Post Falls, Father?
Well, on the whole, things seem to be going quite well. In some ways, it seems like, the difficulties that we've been living through as a result of all the things taking place with COVID are affecting us a little less than I think other places. But so on the whole, very well. Good,
very good. Well, we wanted to have you back, and you graciously volunteered to talk to us for an episode, or probably two episodes, about the preparation for the Second Vatican Council. We're going to be talking with some of our other priests about Vatican II itself, the course, and how it all went. But wanted to talk about the groundwork and how everything started, because that's where everything started. It was before the Second Vatican Council itself. So we've ended with the new theology. We have kind of that all set in terms of a theological standpoint. But in terms of the council itself, there was the First Vatican Council in the late 19th century, and then we have this Second Vatican Council. So where do things begin with this idea of having a Second Vatican Council, Father?
In fact, that's a very good question. In large measure, it had been an idea that had been bounced around for some time, actually, as a result of the fact that the First Vatican Council that you mentioned, which I think would be interesting to go back to briefly in a moment,
sure,
ended rather abruptly. So it had only just begun effectively when the military forces of the Italian state invaded Rome, causing effectively the Council Fathers to have to end all their deliberations and more or less put that off. And so several times over the next few decades, the idea resumed of possibly taking up the work of that council where it had left off. As early, in fact, as under Pius XI, in the 1920s, he consulted with a few of the cardinals, one of whom was Cardinal Bilo, who was a very famous conservative, one who Archbishop Lefebvre looked up to quite a bit. And when Cardinal Bilo was asked his opinion about the advisability of doing a new council, he, for his part, said that was actually a very bad idea. Apparently, he told Pius XI then that one cannot shut one's eyes. A council is desired by the worst enemies of the Church, namely the modernists, who, according to the most reliable evidence, are already preparing to take advantage of the Estates General of the Church to launch a revolution, a new 1789. And what he means by the Estates General, that's a reference back to the French Revolution. That's how that revolution actually started. And then, it came up again under Pius XII, who himself, from what I understand, composed a commission to look into the question before finally deciding on his own level to leave it and not to try to arrange the council. So it had been something that had been going around for some time.
Since the First Vatican Council was kind of died very quickly because of this invasion, there were these rumblings about, getting it back up and going again. In terms of how a council is prepared for, could we maybe compare the First Vatican Council with the Second Vatican Council in terms of how those were being, all the words I'm trying to say are totally poor English, like getting ready for. But could we make a comparison maybe between the two of how those preparations were done, first with the First Vatican Council and then with the Second Vatican Council?
I would think so. And it's not surprising that we have a little bit of a difficulty phrasing how to talk about this, just because it's something that we're not very familiar with. Sure. And at the same time, it's a huge process. So if you look at something like Vatican I initially, so that was the first council in 300 years. The last one being, of course, the Council of Trent in the mid 1500s. And it was something that Pius IX at the time wanted to call in order to really correct a lot of the errors that had been ravaging society in the mid 1800s. He began that by soliciting the opinion of a number of the cardinals in the Roman Curia to get their sense of whether they thought it was a good time, firstly, to do it. And for the most part, the vast majority of them responded, yes, we do think this is a good idea. We should move forward with this. And at that point, what he did was he established a preparatory commission composed of 5 cardinals the next year in March of 1865. So right as our Civil War is drawing to a conclusion. Mm-hmm. And those cardinals would be then charged with putting together all the topics that might be conceivably considered at the council, and to put them to actually compose schemas that might be considered. What they would then do, and this is going to be an interesting contrast with Vatican II. What they did is then they selected a few bishops in different countries, only about 30 or 40, and sent them some inquiries asking what topics they thought would be good to discuss, how to discuss them, etc. And at the same time swore them to secrecy at that moment. It's like, okay, look, we want your opinions. We want to get a sense of what you think would be worthwhile to consider, especially in the context, what errors you see as threatening the church. But at the same time, we don't want to, let's say, trouble souls by an indiscretion of announcing too early that we are considering this. Now, for the next few years...
Father, excuse me, could I just ask real quickly?
Yeah.
The reason why the secrecy, you said it's not to trouble souls, is this because, so if they're going to be taking up something to be discussed, even the mention that they're going to be bringing something up might cause some people to think, oh, well, then this is up for debate, when in reality it may or may not be. Correct,
exactly. Okay. And not only that, but also a premature revelation that these topics might be considered could open up the ground for a lot of pressure to be put on bishops or council fathers by, let's say, the press, which even at that time, it wasn't quite as powerful as what we might think of as in our own day and age or in the time in the Second Vatican Council, but still it had an enormous prestige and weight that it could use to sway public opinion. And if it was premature, that could harm the liberty of the council fathers in approaching these matters.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
And the Pope's intention was, in fact, to try to convene the council on the 1800th anniversary of the martyrdom of Saints Peter and Paul, so in 1867. He took that occasion in June of that year to say, to announce publicly, we are going to do this. We've been doing preparatory work. And it was sufficiently prepared that by June of 1868, so that's a whole year later, the Pope judged that it was time to convoke the council, which is, let's say, that official announcement. We will have a council, and I officially invite all those who have a right to be present, let's say bishops of dioceses, heads of religious orders, etc., to come to Rome in the latter part of 1869. And in that, he announced some of the purposes of the council, which we might summarize as being the correction of modern errors, to really root them out in a very, let's say, definitive manner when you have that whole episcopal body of the church around the Pope and supporting him in these proclamations, as well as to review the legislation for the church, which is a common work of councils as well. Now, one last thing that might be of interest here to look at that work of preparing Vatican I is how non-Catholics were treated. But the way that the Pope at the time handled it is very intriguing. So he published a brief in September of 1868, so after the official convocation of the council, addressed to non-uniate Orientals, in other words, Orthodox, those who are not in union with Rome or schismatic.
Okay.
And he made a point of inviting them to appear, so to be present at the council, not in the context of being contributors, but to be present, to see the deliberations, and of course, with the view that it might be an occasion of grace for them to return to unity, to submit again to the church, kind of like you might say you had at the Council of Florence in the 1430s, where you had representatives of the Orthodox churches, including, in fact, the Archbishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople present, and making their submission to the Pope. So it was kind of the hope that you had there. There was also, published in that same month of September of 1868, another brief that was addressed to Protestants, with a very important difference that as individuals, not being in anything that even remotely resembled a vestige of the church, but being congregations, and so not as not in any ways. And it was just announcing the council to them, and it wasn't inviting them to be present in any fashion.
So it's just letting them know this is what's happening in Rome. This is when it's going to be, but we're not inviting you. You don't get to have a seat at the party.
Correct. More like.
Okay.
And even, of course, with the Orthodox, it wasn't that they had a seat at the party, but they were invited because, again, they have the orders. They have,
Sure.
for the most part, much of what remains.
So this is the preparation for Vatican I, and like you said at the beginning, it's not a common thing to prepare for a council. So there's not like there's this blueprint of how it all goes, but we could say that this is probably the way to get a council started. We can look at this and say this is a good blueprint for it.
Correct. And there was it was a very well prepared, there was a lot that in fact was in the works to be accomplished had it not been interrupted by the political situation. Now, as we kind of saw earlier, because of the fact that it was interrupted, there had been lingering the thought of potentially returning to it. And so it lingers, or it just doesn't happen, or nothing happens with it until the election of John XXIII in 1959. And in fact, it's kind of an interesting thing. When John XXIII is elected, he's relatively old, in fact. So he was elected when he was 76. Which at that time was fairly, it was not a spring chicken.
Right.
And a number of people viewed that he was just kind of a placeholder, which in some ways he was. But he proved to be, in fact, in his own way, quite energetic. And very, very soon after his election, so he's elected in October of 1958, he's already discussing the possibility of a council with several cardinals, apparently, most notably Cardinals Ottaviani and Ruffini, who are members of the Roman Curia, and interestingly enough, are actually conservatives.
Sure.
But for their part, they were very convinced that a council would have been a good idea. Now, John XXIII, unlike Pius IX, one major difference is that he doesn't consult the cardinals about the advisability of a council. He simply, after talking to these two, and then also Domenico Tarnini, who is the Secretary of State, announces it to a small number of the Roman cardinals on the feast of the conversion of St. Paul, which is January 25th in 1959. So that's about 3 months after he's been elected. So it's very much in the beginning of his pontificate. He's not had any time to establish himself or really get a sense of the Roman Curias at all. And here he is announcing this, what would in fact be an immense and huge project. As we'll see, it was amazingly intricate. And in fact, there was even more preparation than what we saw for Vatican I.
I was just going to say, looking at it with the scope of like American politics and, with the new president, this is within the first 100 days, that, magical first 100 days that a U.S. president has. Popes have generally much longer periods of time to get work done. And even still, he's doing this in the first 100 days, which is astounding.
Correct. Part of the reason, of course, that he was so pressing the issue is his own age. He didn't think that he would last very long, and so he did want to push things through. And in fact, he'll only live or be pope for about 4.5 years. He'll die in the late spring, early summer of 1963, after only one session at the Second Vatican Council. And so that's part of why he's pushing so strongly, although at the same time, it's clear that he has something of a vision. A number of historians who comment on that initial announcement, they note that when he made this announcement, the cardinals were shocked. Like, wait, what? And at least later in his testimony, apparently, and Pope John XXIII is like, I was expecting that the cardinals would be like, this is a great idea, and come off like, let's do this. And apparently, not a single one of them said a single word. Like they're all just completely silent. And later on, John XXIII explained that by saying, oh well, it's just kind of this reverent devotion, you might say, in the presence of this. And who knows? I mean, I don't know for sure what was going on in the minds of the men, but certainly what is clear is that they were taken off guard. Like, we don't know what to say. Whether they were for it or against it. It's like, we just don't know.
Right.
And interestingly enough, you had a little bit of a hesitancy, clearly, at least from a number of the members of the Curia. Now, in order to somewhat apparently allay that, John XXIII decided to call a synod of the clergy of Rome, which ultimately was going to be seen as something of a model for what the Second Vatican Council would be. So it's a small scale, not preparation strictly speaking, but example of what the Pope had in mind there. In fact, if the methodology of the Roman Synod had been followed, I think the Second Vatican Council would have pursued a little bit more smoothly. So what happened was John XXIII had put together a commission that served to put together what were called synodal acts. So, which means certain documents that lay out reforms of discipline and insist on certain principles that are to guide the clergy of Rome. So those were prepared before the synod itself.
Okay.
And those documents were then apparently, when all the priests were gathered together, read out to them. It's okay, so that they were just to hear it and be able to assimilate what was going on. And then they were given the opportunity to give written proposals or emendations, so changes that they thought would be appropriate for the document itself. So in other words, apparently, at least according to Xavier Wren, there was not an open debate like you actually had later at the Second Vatican Council. Instead, you had presented the documents that were prepared in advance, and there was a chance there to give some minor modifications, which didn't rework the substance of the documents. And so much so that some of the, let's say, liberals basically looked at this and were a bit contemptuous, apparently, of it, saying that it was merely rubber stamping what had been prepared by those working under John XXIII, although some modifications were, in fact, adopted at the suggestion of the clergy of Rome. So, in other words, there is reception for some feedback from the clergy, but it's somewhat limited.
Okay.
And then if we turn to the content of it, here's where it's actually very interesting, because what the clergy of Rome actually decreed was quite traditional in character in many ways. So both, and I'll read just a little bit of a quote from Iota Unum by Romano Amerio, who talks a little bit about this Roman Synod as well. And he says that this synod, this collection of the clergy of Rome, in fact proposed a very vigorous restoration at every level of ecclesial life. And the discipline of the clergy was modeled on the traditional pattern formulated at the Council of Trent. So in other words, they're looking back, and we'll see concretely in what ways. And he says that it was based primarily on two principles that had always been accepted in practice. The first is that of the peculiar character of the person consecrated to God, supernaturally enabled to do Christ's work, and thus clearly separated from the laity. Sacred meaning separate, which is in fact something that would be profoundly jettisoned as we continue on with the series and we look at what the consequences of Vatican II were. That idea of the priest being separate from the laity by virtue of his mission is both downplayed and in some instances completely dropped. There's a famous phrase in the 70s and 80s, or mainly in the 70s, where a priest is a man like everyone else, basically. Right. He's not separate. And then secondly, and this follows from the first, is that of an ascetical education and sacrificial life, which is a differentiating mark of the clergy as a body. So in other words, the priests are expected to have a certain mortification and life of sacrifice over and above that of the average layman. And so some of the concrete recommendations were that of a return to the vigor of holding a distinct ecclesiastical attire, especially the cassock. So that was reinforced. And over and above that, the tonsure was reinvigorated, and maintained. And in addition to that, this is great. It's actually quite interesting that the clergy were forbidden from being present at public spectacles, like the opera or races, or anything that had that very worldly character. They were forbidden from being present there.
Wow.
And at the same time, the liturgical life was, let's say, restored to its traditional bearings. It's quite fascinating to read this. So for example, because you have to understand in Rome, so you had a lot of experimentation going on in the 50s. So for example, Annibale Bugnini, who would of course be very instrumentally involved in drawing up the new Mass, he's a parish priest in the 1950s, in part because he'd been, he plays a part in a parish. He's not simply a parish priest, but he plays a part in a parish, and he's experimenting in his Roman parish. And so at this synod, it's noted that the tabernacle in the traditional form and place must be maintained. Gregorian chant is ordered. Newly composed popular songs must be submitted to the approval of the bishop. And all appearance of worldliness is forbidden in churches. And the altar itself as well has to be in its proper place. And there's a few other things that are done, but it's all in that same traditional vein. A lot of what the Roman clergy were emphasizing and what they decreed was quite traditional, in fact. There's, on the one hand, what you see in the Roman Synod, where there's this sense of a traditional mindset, but which is going to be undermined at the same time by this, in fact, real openness to the world. With that being said, what I might propose is that we begin now to look at the formal preparations, or what I might actually refer to as the official preparations of the council itself. So again, the Roman Synod had in a way it was meant to be somewhat of a model, somewhat of a guidepost for what the Second Vatican Council could or should be. So this anti-preparatory work began on Pentecost in 1959. So in May, when John XXIII establishes a commission headed by Cardinal Tardini and helped by Monsignor Pericles Felici, who will come back, I'm sure will be mentioned in the course of Vatican II, because he's kind of an important character there. And working under the cardinal were 10 members from the different Roman congregations, so the parts of the curia. Now, what that initially suggests is that the curia, the Roman curia, is going to have a huge role in the direction that the documents will go. So when I said they're gathering information, they're going to do it from three main groups. In the first place, the diocesan bishops throughout the world. So Cardinal Tardini, pretty early on, sends a letter to each and every bishop, diocesan bishop, soliciting their thoughts, their judgments on what the council should deal with. So there's about 2,600 letters sent out. And in the end, they're going to get responses from roughly 2,000 bishops. It's a lot of information that's coming in. One of whom, of course, is Archbishop Lefebvre, who was at the time still the Archbishop of Dakar in Africa. Okay. So in that capacity, he received this letter, and he sent in his response with his recommendations. The second group that they solicited information from were the Roman congregations themselves, the Curia of Rome. So what do you think in your professional capacity needs to be addressed? And then the third group was the rectors of Catholic universities and the deans of the theological faculties in Rome. For example, the Gregorian, the Angelicum.
Okay, so it's purely a just send us what you think we should be talking about, and you can name anything you want, and then we'll review it.
Correct. And in fact, what you just mentioned there, I think, is a very interesting and important point. Both Xavier Wynne and Father Wilken make a point noting that Cardinal Tardini, in the original letter that he sends out, makes a point of refraining from giving any guidance, basically leaving it entirely free to the bishops to submit whatever they think might be of interest, meaning that you get a whole range of different topics.
Does this seem like a good idea to you, Father? I mean, to open it up? I mean, I can see it both ways. I can see it, these are the bishops. They know what's happening in their diocese and on the ground. Let them give us suggestions.
Well, it's interesting to contrast that with, again, how they proceeded in Vatican I, because if you recall, there they made a point of selecting certain bishops and soliciting information from them. So in other words, highlighting those, they had a greater trust in their judgment and in their sense. And also at the same time, by the secrecy that, as we discussed earlier, not putting the position of where people outside the church could put pressure on the bishops, or even, let's say, theologians within dioceses who might have a bishop's ear and be a little bit more inclined to progressivism, which of course will happen with some of the experts that will come to the Second Vatican Council.
Sure.
So I mean, there's the advantage of what are people saying, but there are certainly disadvantages. One of which is just overwhelming amount of response.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, and it's really amazing how much they accomplish, because they, in the end, they got, like I said, they got about 2,000 responses from bishops, which filled up 8 volumes of publication, totaling about 10,000 pages. So they have all that information, and they kind of codify it. And at that point, they begin the second phase, which is now called the preparatory phase. So they have all this information, and now they're going to start using it as kind of a guide to begin formulating the actual documents which will form the basis of what is seen at the council itself. And to do this, this begins at Pentecost. So it's interesting. John XXIII made a very explicit point of trying to link the work of the Second Vatican Council to Pentecost, to that work of the Holy Ghost. He establishes the Central Preparatory Committee, which is going to be the most important in the work of preparation, which contains about 120 members of, let's say, Roman congregations, cardinals, and even heads of religious congregations. And it's in that latter capacity that Archbishop Lefebvre will be a member of the Central Preparatory Commission, one of the 120 members there. Eventually, you're going to have about 800 members of those 10 commissions over and above the 100 members of the Central Preparatory Commission. So you actually have a fairly large body of people that are involved in this. And again, the purpose of these commissions is to draw up documents, which will later be known as decrees or schemas. At the same time, and let me make a comment here too, at the same time, and this will be important later on, that you have those commissions, you have 3 secretariats set up, which don't have the same formal purpose as the commission. So they're not charged with producing any documents that will be considered at the council, but they are involved in the work. So you have one that's set up for a secretariat for the press. Already you have the idea in mind to conduct the council differently than Vatican I was with respect to the press. And then you have a secretariat for more technical things, coordinating, providing documentation, stuff like that. Then the third one is the most interesting secretariat, and going to be the most important in the end, and that's the Secretariat for Christian Unity, which is going to have as its purpose orchestrating those efforts to try to promote ecumenical goals. And the head of this is going to be Cardinal Augustin Bea, who, as I'm sure some of the listeners are aware, would be later very intimately linked with the push for the decree that would later become known as Dignitatis Humanae, in other words, the decree on religious liberty. But with him, you have some of the first initial huge battles that occur between the traditionalists in the Central Preparatory Commission and the progressives, because not only does he produce a document that's dealing with, well, explicitly religious liberty, but Cardinal Ottaviani, the head of the Holy Office at the time, and then the secretary of the Theological Commission, the most important of the commissions, also produced a document which was titled On Religious Toleration. And, to be the text that would be presented at the council. And you had a huge fight between the two of them. And Archbishop Lefebvre was like, wow, this is really a striking thing. So you had these two cardinals, two princes of the Roman Catholic Church, at loggerheads about this critical issue. And of course, Archbishop Lefebvre noted as well that, the document that Cardinal Ottaviani produced had like 14 pages of footnotes. Whereas the one of Cardinal Bea had 0, or at least like maybe 1, or just a very limited amount of footnotes. The point being is that of the two is manifestly obvious which was based on the prior tradition in the magisterium. Now the commissions, those 10 commissions I mentioned, they produce by the time the summer of 1962 comes around about 75 schema.
Okay.
Which then the Central Preparatory Commission takes its rules out a few, combines a few, such that by the time the Central Preparatory Commission has done their work, there's only 20 schema, which are then intended to be presented to the Council Fathers. So, and it's a lot of work. It's a ton. You're taking that 10,000 pages, looking at it, working it out, and producing in the end, over the course of 2 years, 20 schema, which are very developed, and you can even access a few of them that have been translated into English. At that time, you had comments of several members of that commission. So, for example, a Monsignor Vincenzo Carbone, who is quoted by Father Ralph Vilken from the book The Rhine Flows into the Tiber, that no other council had a preparation so vast, so diligently carried out, nor so profound. And it's interesting because ultimately Archbishop Lefebvre also more or less shared that judgment. He commented that the council, as a result of the work of the preparatory commissions, was preparing to proclaim the truth in the face of the contemporary errors in order to cause them to disappear for a long time from the midst of the church. It was disposed to be a luminous cloud. He's referring to, or making a reference to like the cloud that covered Saints Peter, James, and John on Mount Tabor. The shining cloud shining in the world, if it had used the preconciliar texts, in which one found a solemn profession of sure doctrine with respect to modern problems. So in other words, in his judgment, on the whole, the work that had been prepared was solid and would have been a worthy matter for the church to promulgate at the council.
Wow, that's fascinating. So all this work, I mean, we can say a few things about it in a very positive light. I mean, the work was fantastic in terms of its depth and trying to get it all done, and they were very diligent. And B, the work is fairly traditional, at least at this point. It's proclaiming the same things. There's some disagreements, like you said, between Cardinals Bea and Cardinal Ottaviani, but for the most part, this is heading in the right direction.
Correct. We can say that for the most part it was. I mean, there's beyond those disagreements we just mentioned, you also had some problematic things, let's say in the document prepared on the liturgy, which was one of the few, commissions that was more populated by progressives and from liturgists and from Germany and from France, who were more in line with them. But on the whole, it was much more solid than one might have expected. It's kind of in line, that preparation at that point is in line with what we saw with the Roman Synod at that point. Now, perhaps we're coming to a good spot to close today, but maybe just to conclude, I'd like to reference the bull of convocation that John XXIII issued at the latter part in the December of 1961. So that's the official invitation to all those who are meant to be council fathers to present themselves in Rome at a certain date.
Okay.
In here, the document is very intriguing because on the one hand, you do have a fairly serious dose of realism in it, and which would by itself indicate some hope of a serious and well-defined purpose of the council. So, for example, the Pope comments that there's been a weakening in the spiritual life of the world. And he says, thence a weakening in aspirations towards the values of the Spirit. Thence the tendency to seek only earthly pleasures that technological progress brings so easily within the reach of all. Thence also a quite new and disturbing fact, the existence of a militant atheism operating all over the world. It's a pretty strong statement. It's militant atheism, which, though it's not, let's say, explicit, is almost certainly a reference to the growth of communism, which was both atheistic and militant in its attempts to spread itself. Now, had the council been called specifically to address these issues and to give that true light to the world and to warn people from these dangers, we can say that it would have been a very good and fruitful thing that would have, as Archbishop Lefebvre said, buried a lot of errors for a significant time. The only problem is, unfortunately, is that in addition to this official preparation, and perhaps what we can see next time, there was a lot of underground preparation behind the scenes that led to the basic undermining of all that had been positive in preparation for this. An underground preparation that was unfortunately somewhat fostered by John XXIII, as we'll see when we start again next time.
Wow, that's very interesting. Well, Father, thank you for giving us this introduction. And it's very sad because at this point, at this point in our conversation and at this point in all the preparations, this seems pretty good. And now people have to go and ruin it. This is why we can't have nice things.
That's true.
Come on. Well, thank you, Father. We'll be chatting again next time then about some of this underground preparation and then what leads up to the very beginning of the council. And that will be very, very interesting indeed. Father Luke, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Father.
All right.
Thank you for listening to and watching episode 17 of our Crisis in the Church series here on the SSPX podcast. In episode 18, we will welcome back Father Loop to finish our study on the preparation for the council. This time, we'll be looking at the underground preparations, the work that was being done by neo-modernists in order to undermine the good work that was about to be undertaken. If you have a question on the topic of the crisis, please feel free to ask it at sspxpodcast.com/crisis. Please share this episode with someone who you might think would enjoy it. And if they don't know what a podcast is, please show them so that they can take advantage of all our episodes. And if you have the ability to set up a monthly recurring donation of $5 or $10 or $20 on sspxpodcast.com, it would help us immensely to complete this Crisis in the Church project. Until next week, thank you for listening, and God bless you.